1174 AD. Damascus did not cheer when Saladin took power. It watched. Because in the Islamic world, a new ruler was not a celebration. It was a forecast of blood. Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, Saladin, didn't rise from a throne. He rose from war camps, debt, and enemy maps. He learned early that kingdoms don't fall to armies first. They fall to hesitation. The world he entered was shattered into pieces that hated each other more than they feared crusaders. Syria fractured. Egypt was ruled by the fading Fatimid Caliphate. The Zengids fought for inheritance. Emirs betrayed emirs for a single city wall. And the Crusader states sat along the coast like knives planted in the land. Jerusalem, Tripoli, Antioch, waiting for Muslims to keep bleeding each other. Saladin's first master was not a crown. It was discipline. 1164-1169, Egypt. He arrived there with his uncle Shirkuh, sent by Nur al-Din of Syria. Egypt was rich, unstable, and dying from inside. The Fatimid court was poison. Viziers assassinated, alliances flipped overnight, soldiers sold loyalty to the highest bidder. The Crusaders watched Egypt like predators. If they took it, the Muslim world would be split forever. Shirkuh fought, negotiated, murdered rivals, and won Cairo, then died fast. 1169 AD. And suddenly Saladin, young, underestimated, was appointed vizier of Egypt. Vizier, not king, not sultan, a servant's title. But Saladin understood a brutal truth. If you control the treasury, you control the sword. If you control the sword, you control the story. He moved quietly at first. He replaced commanders. He bought loyalty with pay. He broke opponents by cutting their supply lines, not by speeches. He built an army inside a palace that distrusted him, and while the Fatimid regime still breathed, Saladin began preparing its funeral. 1171 AD, Cairo, the Fatimid Caliphate ended. Not with a theatrical battle, with a decision. The Friday sermon, the khutbah, was changed to name the Sunni Abbasid Caliph instead. That single act executed a dynasty in public. An empire died in a mosque, and Egypt became Saladin's engine. But Nur al-Din, his overlord, still lived in Syria, and Nur al-Din did not raise Saladin to become a rival. He raised him to be a tool. 1174 AD. Nur al-Din died, and the moment he died, the Muslim world did what it always did. It started tearing itself apart over the corpse. A child heir sat in Aleppo. Ambitious emirs smelled weakness. Damascus feared being swallowed. The Crusaders watched borders loosen like bandages on a wound. Saladin did not wait for permission. He marched north from Egypt to Syria with speed that looked like certainty. He entered Damascus and took it, not as a conqueror, but as a protector. That word was camouflage, because in war, the cleanest takeover is the one the victim calls safety. Then came the real work, unification through pressure. 1175-1186. Syria and northern Mesopotamia became a battlefield of negotiations backed by siege engines. Cities were offered terms. If they refused, their fields were burned, their gates starved, their allies isolated, their leaders humiliated. Saladin did not need to massacre every city. He needed every city to believe resistance was expensive. He built a coalition the hard way, by making enemies choose between joining him or being swallowed by someone worse. Aleppo resisted, Mosul resisted, emirs resisted, even allies resisted. Saladin answered with relentless campaigning, moving, circling, cutting roads, striking fast, then offering mercy that still sounded like a threat. Because he wasn't building peace, he was building a single fist. Meanwhile, the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem was rotting from within. Kings were sick, regents fought, nobles schemed. Orders of knights, Templars and Hospitallers pushed war even when diplomacy might survive. On the border, raids became routine, villages burned, caravans were slaughtered, prisoners were taken like currency, and one man became the spark, Reynold of Chatillon, a Crusader lord who treated truces like jokes. He attacked caravans, seized wealth, and threatened the holy cities. He didn't just raid, he tried to provoke an apocalypse. Saladin made a decision then that changed everything. No more containment, no more balancing games. He would break the Crusader states permanently. 1187 AD. This is where the world thinks the story begins. But the truth is, it began years earlier, when Saladin learned that unity is not an ideal. It is a weapon. He gathered armies from Egypt, Syria, Jazeera. He pulled banners that had never marched together. He turned rival warlords into a single machine, not because they loved him, because he made the alternative look like death. He moved into Galilee. He baited the Crusader army away from water. He forced them to chase him across heat and dust, dragging heavy armor, thirst chewing their throats raw. And he waited for the moment their discipline broke. Near the Horns of Hattin, July 1187, he closed the trap. The Crusader army was surrounded, exhausted, dehydrated, collapsing. Smoke rose from burning brush. Arrows fell like punishment. Charges failed. Lines folded. The kingdom of Jerusalem was being crushed in one day. Saladin captured King Guy of Lusignan. He captured the true cross. He captured the core of Crusader power. And he took Reynald. This was the moment he made personal. He did not treat Reynald like a noble prisoner. He treated him like a warning. Reynald had made war inevitable. So Saladin ended him, not as revenge alone, as a message carved into the minds of every lord who thought treaties were weak. After Hattin, the coast cracked open. Cities fell one by one. Acre, Nablus, Jaffa's defenses shaken. Ascalon submitted. The map changed fast, because once the main army dies, walls become negotiations. And then Jerusalem stood alone. September-October 1187. Jerusalem had been taken in 1099 with slaughter. Everyone expected the same ending now. They expected Saladin to answer blood with blood. Instead, he did something colder. He made mercy into conquest. He took Jerusalem by siege and terms. Ransom was demanded. Prisoners were freed. Order was enforced. The city returned to Muslim rule without being turned into a corpse field. But do not misunderstand it as softness. It was strategy. He needed legitimacy. He needed the world to see him as a ruler, not a butcher, because he knew what would come next. Europe would not accept Jerusalem lost, not in silence. And far across the sea, the Third Crusade was already forming, kings, fleets, and armies sharpening toward him. Saladin had won the Holy City. Now he had to survive the revenge of continents. The fall of Jerusalem did not end the war. It detonated it. When news reached Europe, it landed like an accusation. Jerusalem was not just a city, it was a promise that had been broken. Kings who hated each other suddenly shared a single purpose. Pride turned into vows. Faith turned into logistics. The Third Crusade was not an army. It was a collision of egos. Frederick Barbarossa, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, marched by land with a force that terrified every border it crossed. Richard I of England, Lionheart, prepared fleets, siege engines, and a reputation built on violence. Philip II of France came with ambition, sharpened by rivalry. Saladin watched all of it with precision. He did not panic. He calculated. He knew Europe could send armies. It could not send patience. 1189 AD Acre. The city became the wound that would not close. The Crusaders laid siege by sea and land. Saladin encircled the besiegers. Two armies trapped each other. Inside Acre, starvation ruled. Outside Acre, disease ruled. Between them, time ruled. Saladin attacked supply lines relentlessly. Night raids, harassment, burned camps, constant pressure, not to destroy, but to exhaust. Frederick Barbarossa never arrived. He drowned crossing a river. His army disintegrated before reaching the battlefield. One king erased by geography. Richard arrived, and everything sharpened. Richard Lionheart was not reckless. He was precise violence. He reorganized the Crusader forces. He stabilized morale. He turned chaos into momentum. Saladin recognized the danger immediately. Richard was not like the kings he had already broken. This one understood war as rhythm. Acre fell in 1191, and with it, restraint collapsed. Richard executed thousands of Muslim prisoners outside the city, public, deliberate, a statement written in blood. Saladin answered not with imitation, but escalation. Raids intensified. Captured knights were killed in response. The war turned personal, but never careless. What followed was not a campaign. It was a duel stretched across a coastline. 1191, 1192, Arsuf. Richard marched south. Saladin harassed constantly. Arrows, feints, retreats, pressure without commitment. At Arsuf, Saladin tested Richard's discipline. Hours of attack, relentless provocation, waiting for panic. It never came. When Richard counterattacked, it was surgical. The Crusader charge broke Saladin's line. Not a rout, but a real defeat. Saladin withdrew immediately. He did not chase lost ground. He preserved the army. Because this war was not about winning battles. It was about not losing the war. From that moment, mutual respect formed between enemies. They studied each other, adapted, anticipated. Jerusalem became the unspoken center. Richard wanted it. Saladin would not risk everything for its walls. So they circled. Jaffa changed hands. Supply ports burned. Castles fell and were abandoned. Neither side could land a killing blow. Saladin destroyed wells, scorched fields, collapsed roads. He turned geography into a weapon. Every mile inland became punishment. Richard reached Jaffa again. He rebuilt defenses. He pushed inland, but stopped. Because without water, without local support, without momentum, Jerusalem was a trap. Saladin reinforced the city, not with bravado, with discipline. He knew if Richard took Jerusalem, Europe would never stop coming. If Richard failed, the crusade would rot from disappointment. Negotiations began, not from weakness, from clarity. 1192 AD. A treaty was signed. Jerusalem would remain under Muslim control. Christian pilgrims would be allowed access. The Crusader states would survive, but shrunk, exposed, and fragile. Richard left. Philip had already gone. Europe's fire cooled. Saladin did not celebrate. He assessed damage. The war had drained resources. The army was exhausted. The state had held, but barely. And Saladin understood something brutal. He had unified the Islamic world through war. But war could not sustain unity forever. He spent his final years stabilizing, paying soldiers, repairing cities, restoring order. 1193 AD. Saladin died in Damascus. He left behind an empire that stretched across Egypt, Syria, and beyond. And almost no personal wealth. His treasury was empty. His legacy was not. He had done what centuries had failed to do, unified fractured lands, broken Crusader dominance, and returned Jerusalem without drowning it in blood. But the unity did not survive him. Because Saladin built a system that depended on his judgment, not institutions strong enough to replace it. After his death, the empire fractured into Ayyubid states. Brothers fought nephews. Allies became rivals. The Crusader states survived longer than expected, yet the world had changed permanently. Jerusalem was no longer inevitable. Crusader expansion was no longer unstoppable. The myth of European invincibility had been buried at Hattin. Saladin's true victory was not territory. It was precedent. He proved that unity could be forged without annihilation. That strategy could defeat fanaticism. That discipline could outlast brutality. And long after the Crusades ended, his name remained a warning and a lesson. To conquerors, to kings, to history itself. Because Saladin did not win by destroying everything in front of him. He won by making his enemies spend more than they could afford. In blood, in time, and in belief. The treaty did not end the Crusades. It exposed them. When Richard left the Levant, Europe pretended the Third Crusade had been a moral stand. In reality, it was a lesson in limits. Armies could cross continents, faith could move masses, but control could not be imported and maintained forever. Jerusalem remained standing, and that fact haunted Europe more than any defeat. The Crusader states that survived after 1192 were shadows of ambition. Thin coastal strips, fortresses clinging to supply lines, cities that existed only because someone stronger allowed them to. Saladin's restraint had changed the equation. He had not annihilated the Crusaders. He had contained them, and containment was more humiliating than destruction. Europe fractured again. Kings returned home to unfinished rivalries. Richard was captured in Europe and ransomed like common prey. Philip consolidated power while pretending loyalty. The idea of a united Christendom evaporated the moment ships touched European ports. The Crusades continued, but never with the same certainty. Saladin's death revealed the second truth of power. Unity built around a single will does not survive its absence. The Ayyubid Empire fractured almost immediately. Territory split among sons, brothers, nephews. Command became negotiation. Strategy became compromise. The Crusader states noticed. They survived by exploiting division, playing rulers against each other, trading loyalty for time, buying survival one treaty at a time. But the momentum had shifted permanently. No Crusader army would ever again march with the assumption of inevitability. No European king could promise Jerusalem without lying. The psychological center of the war had moved. Jerusalem was no longer a prize, it was a liability. Holding it required endless defense. Losing it sparked endless crusades. Both sides understood this now. The city became frozen in tension. Pilgrims walked its streets under Muslim protection. Merchants traded across religious lines. Soldiers watched from walls knowing any spark could ignite everything again. This uneasy balance lasted generations, and it changed how wars were fought. The age of blind crusading gave way to calculated intervention. Military orders replaced mass armies. Castles replaced marches. Trade routes mattered more than holy speeches. The Templars and Hospitallers became states within states. War turned professional. Faith became branding. Saladin's influence extended beyond Islam. European chroniclers, even hostile ones, described him with reluctant admiration. Not for mercy alone, but for control. He had defeated crusading ideology without becoming its mirror. Future Muslim leaders tried to imitate him. Most failed. Because Saladin's strength was not ferocity. It was discipline under pressure. He knew when not to fight, when not to chase, when not to destroy. That restraint preserved legitimacy, and legitimacy outlived armies. The Crusades continued into the 13th century. They failed repeatedly, not because Europe lacked soldiers, but because it lacked a unifying truth powerful enough to override reality. By the time Jerusalem fell again in 1229 through diplomacy rather than battle, the war had already lost its meaning. The Crusades did not end with a final defeat. They ended with irrelevance. Trade replaced conquest. Diplomacy replaced pilgrimage armies. Empires learned to manage difference instead of erasing it. Saladin did not live to see this outcome, but he shaped it. He proved that holy war collapses when confronted with patience, that fanaticism burns itself out against endurance, and that the most dangerous enemy is not the one who charges, but the one who waits. That lesson traveled far beyond the Levant. Mongols would learn it. Ottomans would apply it. Europe itself would later weaponize it through empire. Saladin's name faded from battlefields, but his method remained. Win without annihilating. Hold without provoking endless retaliation. End wars by making them too expensive to continue. That was the real end of the Third Crusade. Not victory, not defeat, exhaustion. And exhaustion is how eras die. Exhaustion did not bring peace, it brought transformation. When the crusading fire cooled, something colder replaced it. Calculation, accounting, memory. Europe did not forget Jerusalem. It learned how to fail around it. Kings stopped promising salvation. They promised access, ports, privileges, trade routes, influence without occupation. The Levant shifted from battlefield to marketplace. Italian city-states arrived not with banners, but with contracts. Venice, Genoa, Pisa, ships replaced armies. Coin replaced blood. Religion remained loud, but profit became decisive. The Muslim world changed too. After Saladin, legitimacy fractured. Every ruler claimed to be his heir. Few carried his discipline. Ambition returned faster than unity. Fortresses multiplied. Borders hardened. Trust disappeared. War became permanent background noise. Not crusade, not jihad. Competition. The holy war had professionalized. Castles were no longer symbols. They were insurance policies. Supply lines mattered more than sermons. Logistics mattered more than prophecy. Jerusalem remained standing, but it no longer decided history. That role moved elsewhere. Egypt rose, not as battlefield, as center. Control of the Nile meant control of food. Food meant leverage. Leverage meant survival. The Mamluks emerged from slavery, bought, trained, weaponized, men without lineage, without inheritance, without mercy. They did not fight for ideology, they fought for position, and they learned fast. When the Mongols arrived, unstoppable, systematic, merciless, the world braced for collapse. Cities burned, empires vanished, legends ended in weeks. The Mongols did not care about Jerusalem, they cared about submission. That indifference terrified everyone. And then, at Ain Jalut, the pattern broke. The Mamluks stopped them. Not with faith, not with numbers, with preparation, ambush, terrain, timing. For the first time, the Mongols retreated. That moment mattered more than any crusade, because it proved something terrifying. Invincibility was temporary. From that point on, the Islamic world no longer feared extinction. It feared miscalculation. Europe noticed. The age of divine inevitability was over. The age of strategic realism began. Crusading language survived. Crusading logic died. Wars were now justified by necessity, not destiny. Empires grew by administration, not banners. And in that transition, Saladin's shadow remained, not as a conqueror, as a calibrator. He had shown how to absorb an enemy's momentum, how to win by denying purpose, how to let opponents exhaust themselves into irrelevance. That method outlived him. Centuries later, colonial powers would use it. Containment, indirect rule, client states, economic pressure, win without total war, control without permanent occupation. The world did not call it Saladin's method, but it followed it instinctively, because history rewards those who end wars by making them meaningless. Jerusalem became symbolic, then historic, then touristic. Empires rose and fell around it. The Crusades were remembered as passion. Saladin was remembered as patience. One burned bright and vanished. The other shaped centuries quietly. That is how eras truly end, not with screams, with adaptation. And adaptation always favors the side that understands time better than victory. What followed was not an age of peace. It was an age of management. After the shock of Ain Jalut, power stopped pretending it was eternal. Every ruler understood something fundamental had shifted. No force was unstoppable, but every force could be optimized. The Mongols adapted. They stopped charging blindly. They negotiated. They fragmented. They ruled through fear mixed with administration. The Mamluks adapted faster. They built a state designed for war readiness, rotation of power, no dynastic certainty, no inherited complacency. Every ruler was replaceable. Every soldier was trained. Every threat was anticipated. That system terrified neighbors more than ideology ever had. Egypt became a wall, not just against crusaders, against chaos itself. Trade routes stabilized under controlled violence. Pilgrims moved under supervision. Merchants paid tolls instead of bribes. Order returned, not because people trusted rulers, but because unpredictability was punished immediately. Europe entered a different crisis. The crusading ideal collapsed into embarrassment. Kings who had sworn oaths returned bankrupt. Nobles sold land. Populations questioned divine favor. Faith did not disappear. Authority weakened, so power shifted inward. Monarchs consolidated. They taxed harder. They centralized armies. They reduced the church's direct control over war. What the Crusades failed to deliver, state-building replaced. Standing armies emerged. Professional logistics replaced feudal enthusiasm. War became a profession, not a vow. This was the real legacy of failure, not humility, efficiency. And efficiency has no patience for myth. The Mediterranean became a shared system. Muslim ports, Christian ports, Jewish financiers, neutral merchants. Conflict never vanished. It normalized. Borders hardened. Diplomacy professionalized. Spies replaced prophets. Saladin's era had closed the chapter of holy absolutism. The next centuries wrote something colder. Power no longer asked God for permission. It asked accountants. Maps mattered more than relics. Supply mattered more than sermons. Jerusalem faded from strategy. It survived in memory, and memory became a tool, used selectively, invoked when useful, ignored when costly. That is how history metabolizes obsession. The city that once pulled empires toward it became a reference point, not a destination. The Crusades ended, not when swords stopped, but when leaders stopped caring enough to lose everything for them. From that moment forward, wars were fought for outcomes, not absolution. And that shift, more than any battle, is what reshaped the world that followed. Power after myth does not announce itself, it reorganizes. By the late 13th century, the world that had fed on crusade and conquest began feeding on systems. The Mongol shock taught everyone the same lesson at once. Speed wins battles, but structure wins centuries. Empires that survived did so by learning how to metabolize fear into routine. The Mongols refined rule into compartments: census, tax quotas, postal relays, hostages as policy, mercy as scheduling, terror as punctuation. Cities that complied lived predictably. Cities that resisted disappeared predictably. Chaos was eliminated not by morality, but by consistency. In Egypt and Syria, the Mamluk state perfected something rarer: a war government that never slept. Slavery became pipeline. Training became identity. Command rotated to prevent decay. Kingship was an office, not a bloodline. The result was stability built from constant readiness. Every ruler knew he could be replaced. Every general knew he would be tested. Loyalty was earned daily or revoked instantly. This frightened rivals more than banners ever had. Across Anatolia, the Seljuks weakened. Principalities splintered. Into that vacuum stepped frontier warlords who understood something ancient states had forgotten. Legitimacy is strongest where borders are weakest. They fought, taxed, prayed, and waited. Among them, one house learned faster than the rest. Not by claiming destiny, but by mastering logistics and patience. Expansion by absorption. War by invitation. Law by usefulness. Europe watched and learned badly at first. Kings tried to centralize without capacity. They taxed without supply chains. They raised armies without pay. Rebellions followed. Plagues followed. The Black Death erased certainty and revealed what mattered when faith could not protect bodies. Labor gained leverage. Cities gained power. Nobles learned that lineage could not stop hunger. States adapted or fractured. Bureaucracy thickened. Records multiplied. Standing forces replaced seasonal levies. Coin replaced vow. Command replaced charisma. Religion remained, but it stopped deciding outcomes alone. It became alignment, not engine. Trade rethreaded the world. Caravans linked China to the Mediterranean through negotiated corridors. Ports synchronized calendars. Credit crossed borders faster than armies. Insurance replaced blessing. Contracts replaced pilgrimage. The Silk Road was no longer a road, it was a protocol. Jerusalem remained sacred. It stopped being decisive. The memory of holy war hardened into rhetoric. Leaders learned how to invoke it without obeying it. Mobilization became optional. Peace became profitable. Violence became targeted. This was the quiet revolution. Power learned to hide behind procedure. When cities rebelled, they were isolated financially before being isolated militarily. When princes resisted, marriages outflanked them. When borders shifted, treaties arrived before troops. War did not disappear. It professionalized. Histories changed tone. Chroniclers stopped writing miracles and started counting provisions. Victory was measured in months supplied, not saints pleased. Failure was audited, success was replicated. And in this colder world, legitimacy no longer came from heaven alone. It came from performance. Rulers who delivered safety survived. Those who delivered spectacle did not. The age of banners gave way to the age of files. The age of vows gave way to the age of payroll. The age of crusade gave way to the age of state. And the states that endured were the ones that learned the hardest lesson. People do not obey ideas forever. They obey systems that work. What followed was not peace. It was reliability, reliable punishment, reliable reward, reliable borders, reliable hunger relief, reliable roads. The mythic age had burned itself out. What replaced it was harder to see, harder to resist, and far harder to kill. Because systems do not bleed. They wait, they learn, they spread. Modernity did not arrive with fireworks. It arrived with forms. Paper replaced proclamation. Stamps replaced swords. Files replaced faces. Power stopped needing to be seen to be felt. It learned to move through offices, signatures, and schedules. Authority became quiet, and therefore harder to challenge. Armies changed first, uniforms standardized. Training manuals replaced legend. Drill replaced bravery. Men were no longer raised to win battles. They were trained to execute procedures. The musket did not care about courage. The cannon did not care about lineage. Survival belonged to coordination. States counted everything: population, grain, iron, coal. Hours worked, miles of road. If it could be measured, it could be controlled. If it could be controlled, it could be predicted. If it could be predicted, it could be ruled. Revolutions tried to interrupt this. They succeeded briefly. Then they were absorbed. Crowds could overthrow kings. They could not replace supply chains. The French Revolution proved the point brutally. It killed symbols faster than it built systems. So it rebuilt the same machinery, only louder. Calendars changed, titles changed, executions changed hands. The state remained. Napoleon understood this instantly. He did not crown himself to revive monarchy. He crowned himself to stabilize administration. Codes, prefects, conscription, merit, centralization. He conquered less with armies than with templates. Every territory he touched learned how to govern like him, even after he fell. Industry finished the transformation. Factories taught obedience through time. Whistles replaced prayers. Shifts replaced seasons. Pay replaced loyalty. People learned to obey clocks. Cities expanded into grids. Police replaced watchmen. Courts replaced vendetta. Prisons replaced exile. Punishment became standardized. Mercy became discretionary. Justice became procedural. Empires no longer needed to convince subjects they were divine. They needed to prove they were efficient. Colonial rule perfected extraction, not through constant violence, but through predictability. Taxes collected on schedule, labor organized by census, resistance punished selectively. Rebellion did not end, it professionalized too. Ideologies rose: nationalism, socialism, fascism. Each promised meaning, each demanded structure. The winners were never the loudest believers. They were the best administrators. Wars became industrial audits. Who could mobilize faster? Who could feed longer? Who could replace losses efficiently? Victory belonged to logistics. The 20th century burned with scale, not because people became crueler, but because systems became stronger. Genocide required paperwork. Bombing required timetables. Occupation required forms. After the smoke cleared, no one dismantled the machine. They upgraded it. International law did not stop war. It organized it. Finance crossed borders faster than refugees. Data moved faster than armies. Narratives moved faster than facts. Power became abstract. You could no longer point at it. You could only feel it when it failed. When electricity stopped. When food shelves emptied. When money froze. People learned fear of interruption. And fear of interruption is obedience's most reliable ally. The modern state no longer needs to threaten daily. It only needs to promise continuity. Miss a paycheck, miss a delivery, miss a signal. Order collapses faster than belief ever did. So the lesson returned, stripped of myth. Control the flow, control the rhythm, control the memory. Everything else negotiates itself. The ancient world built monuments to prove permanence. The modern world builds systems to make permanence unnecessary. Stone demanded faith. Systems demand participation, and participation is harder to refuse. That is why the final conquest was not land, not cities, not even people. It was dependency. Once people need the system to survive, the system no longer needs to convince them. It only needs to continue, and it will. Dependency finished what fear began. When survival is routed through systems, resistance becomes self-harm. The question is no longer, do you agree? It becomes, can you afford to stop? Power does not argue, it schedules. Health becomes access. Work becomes compliance. Movement becomes permission. The system does not need loyalty, it needs usage. Modern authority perfected this by separating cause from effect. Decisions are made far from consequences. Responsibility dissolves into process. No one orders harm. Harm simply happens according to policy. Violence becomes administrative. A permit denied, a file delayed, a number misclassified, a payment suspended. Lives do not end with screams. They end with waiting. This is the quiet brutality of mature power. Nothing feels like oppression until you try to leave it. Technology accelerated the shift. Telegraphs centralized command. Telephones compressed time. Computers erased distance. Networks dissolved borders. Power stopped living in capitals. It lived in servers. Data became the new territory. Who collects it? Who stores it? Who interprets it? Who decides when it matters? Surveillance did not begin with cameras, it began with records. Birth, school, employment, health, debt. A life reduced to fields and flags. The modern citizen is not ruled by kings. He is ruled by continuity. Break continuity, and punishment arrives automatically. This is why rebellion changed shape. Uprisings still happen. They burn bright. They fade fast. Because systems do not need to defeat rebels. They only need to outlast them. Miss 2 weeks of wages. Miss 1 medication refill. Miss 1 rent cycle. The crowd disperses on its own. Revolutionaries learned this the hard way. So did empires. The Soviet Union collapsed not from invasion, but from inefficiency. It could not deliver continuity. Shelves emptied. Signals failed. Trust evaporated. The system starved itself. China learned the opposite lesson. Control continuity first. Ideology second. Infrastructure before belief. Stability before persuasion. Power. There does not need constant repression. It needs reliability. Authoritarianism matured. Democracy adapted. Both converged on the same mechanics. Different narratives. Identical dependencies. Voting exists. Choice exists. Only within boundaries the system already accepts. Freedom survives. But it is fenced. Globalization deepened the trap. Supply chains crossed oceans. Production fragmented. No nation became self-sufficient. Everyone became necessary and vulnerable. Crisis revealed the truth. When shipping stopped, when factories paused, when borders closed, power did not negotiate. It rationed. Movement permits. Essential status. Priority lists. The language of emergency returned because emergency always clarifies authority. People accepted it, not because they were weak, because they were dependent. History repeated itself with cleaner hands. The ancient state ruled by fear of gods, the medieval state ruled by force of arms, the modern state rules by interruption. Turn off the lights, freeze the account, delay the system, compliance follows, and yet this power remains invisible. No statue, no crown, no throne, only dashboards. That invisibility is its shield. You cannot overthrow what you cannot see. You can only log out, and logging out costs everything. This is the final refinement of rule, a system so embedded that escape feels irrational, and so people defend it, argue for it, fight each other to preserve it. Not because it is just, because it is familiar. That is how control survives without chains. It teaches people to confuse survival with obedience. And once that confusion settles, power no longer needs to conquer. It waits. Because nothing moves faster than a system people are afraid to interrupt. What people call freedom did not disappear. It was reorganized. Choice still exists, but it is filtered, curated, sequenced. You may choose between options, never over the structure that creates them. This is not accidental. It is efficient. Older empires demanded belief. Modern systems demand participation. You do not have to agree. You only have to comply long enough for alternatives to become impossible. Education teaches adaptation, not challenge. Work teaches optimization, not refusal. Media teaches reaction, not memory. Attention is fragmented. Outrage is scheduled. Forgetting is automatic. Nothing needs to be censored when everything is diluted. Truth is not suppressed. It is buried under relevance. The system does not erase dissent. It surrounds it with noise until it starves. This is why collapse looks impossible from the inside. Every failure is localized. Every crisis is explained. Every contradiction is patched. There is always a technical reason, a logistical delay, an unforeseen variable. Blame floats. Authority stays fixed. People sense this. They feel the pressure, but they cannot name the source. So frustration turns sideways. Groups fight groups. Generations blame generations. Neighbors argue politics while the structure watches silently. Division is not chaos, it is insulation. When anger spreads horizontally, it never moves upward. The system survives because it never stands still. Rules update, interfaces change, language softens, control learns to sound reasonable, restrictions become guidelines, monitoring becomes safety, obedience becomes responsibility. Resistance looks childish against a machine that speaks calmly. And still, cracks appear, not as revolutions, as refusals. People slow down, opt out quietly, withhold effort, disengage emotionally. This terrifies power more than riots, because systems require participation more than obedience. When people stop caring, stop believing, stop performing, the machinery grinds. That is why engagement is enforced. Notifications never sleep. Metrics demand attention. Platforms reward reaction. Silence is dangerous. The greatest threat to modern control is not rebellion. It is indifference. A population that does not consume, does not argue, does not identify, does not react, cannot be governed efficiently. So identity is amplified, tribes are encouraged, labels multiply, belonging becomes a substitute for meaning. People fight to defend symbols that do not feed them, structures that do not protect them, systems that would replace them instantly. This is not stupidity, it is conditioning. Belief was outsourced to process. Trust was transferred to infrastructure. When systems work, people assume legitimacy. When they fail, people demand repair, not replacement. That is the trap. The machine can break and still be worshipped, because dependence rewrites logic. And logic, once bent enough, stops asking where power lives. It asks only one question: can I survive without this? As long as the answer feels like no, the system wins, not by force, not by fear, by making itself the shortest path between life and tomorrow. And that is why the future will not be decided by who shouts the loudest, but by who controls continuity, who keeps the lights on, who keeps food moving, who keeps networks alive. Everything else is theater, because in the end, power no longer needs to be loved or even respected. It only needs to be necessary, and necessity, once established, is almost impossible to argue with. History does not repeat itself, it refines its methods. What once required armies now requires protocols. What once needed terror now needs consent engineered through comfort. Power no longer announces itself, it integrates. You do not see chains because you are inside the mechanism. Movement feels free because the paths are predefined. Every system learns this lesson eventually. Force creates resistance, but convenience creates dependence. So power optimized itself. Borders became data, surveillance became service, control became personalization. The citizen became a user, the subject became a profile, the population became an audience. Nothing is imposed, everything is suggested. Algorithms do not command, they nudge, and nudges, repeated enough, become habits. Habits become identity, identity becomes defense. People protect the system because they mistake it for themselves. This is the final evolution of authority, when power no longer sits above society, but flows through it. When enforcement is outsourced to peers, when punishment is social, when exile is digital, when obedience feels voluntary. The state does not need to silence you if it can make you irrelevant. Visibility replaces voice, reach replaces truth, engagement replaces meaning. What is not amplified might as well not exist. So power controls amplification, not by banning ideas, but by ranking them. What rises feels important, what sinks feels wrong. No verdict is issued, the feed decides. And because the feed is endless, no conclusion is ever final. Outrage cycles, scandals rotate, nothing resolves. Permanent distraction is the strongest form of stability. Revolutions require focus. Focus requires memory. Memory requires stillness. Stillness is gone. Every second offers replacement. Every pause is filled. Every silence is interrupted. This is not accidental. It is defensive architecture. A system that never lets you stop, never lets you think beyond it. And yet, history shows something power cannot delete. Fatigue. Not anger. Not hatred. Fatigue. The moment people stop chasing updates, stop performing opinions, stop